Winter winds howl through the Sangre de Cristo range, burying old secrets beneath 5 feet of heavy, unforgiving powder. Down in the valley, a stolen winter cache meant certain starvation for an isolated family. Those thieves made one fatal miscalculation. They forgot about the mountain man who loved their daughter. Frost clung to Sinclair Caldwell's beard like shards of shattered glass as he navigated the treacherous descent from the high peaks. He was a man carved from the very granite of the territory, broad-shouldered, weather-beaten, and draped in thick buffalo hide. A solitary trapper by trade, Sinclair preferred the quiet company of the towering pines to the noisy, treacherous streets of the frontier settlements. Yet, as the first brutal blizzard of 1874 threatened to lock the territory in ice, his thoughts were not on his own survival, but on a secluded cabin sitting in the shadow of the foothills. There lived Thomas and Crystal. They were Apache, though they had adopted Western names to navigate the hostile prejudices of the sprawling cattle towns pushing against their ancestral lands. Thomas was a revered elder of his band, a man whose body bore the scars of decades of conflict, now seeking only peace in his twilight years. Crystal, his daughter, possessed a quiet, unyielding strength that had captured Sinclair's heart 3 winters ago. She had a way of looking right through the rough exterior of the mountain man, seeing the quiet loneliness he carried. Their romance was a closely guarded secret, spoken only in lingering glances over trading fires and shared moments by the riverbank. Sinclair had spent the entire autumn trapping. Sinclair nudged his pack horse, a sturdy roan named Jericho, through the belly-deep snowdrifts. As the familiar outline of Thomas and Crystal's homestead emerged through the swirling whiteout, Sinclair felt a sudden, sickening knot tighten in his gut. There was no smoke rising from the stone chimney. The heavy wooden shutters, usually bolted tight against the northern gales, swung wildly on broken leather hinges, slapping against the log walls like a ticking metronome of disaster. He dropped from his saddle before Jericho had even come to a full halt. His hand instinctively fell to the cold iron of his Hawken rifle. "Crystal," Sinclair bellowed, his deep voice swallowed instantly by the roaring wind. Kicking the half-open door aside, he stepped into the gloom of the cabin. The sight that greeted him made his blood run colder than the blizzard outside. The cabin had been ransacked. Every clay jar of dried corn, every bundle of smoked venison, every woven blanket they had painstakingly crafted over the summer, gone. The heavy oak floorboards covering their root cellar had been pried up and splintered. In the corner, huddled beneath a single frayed wool blanket, sat Crystal. She was cradling Thomas, whose breathing was ragged and shallow. A dark, ugly bruise covered the left side of the old man's face, swelling his eye shut. Sinclair dropped to his knees beside them, pulling off his heavy fur mittens to press a warm, calloused hand against Crystal's freezing cheek. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous gravel. Crystal looked up, her dark eyes swimming with unshed tears, yet burning with a fierce, quiet dignity. "Men from the settlement," she whispered, her voice trembling from the biting cold. "They came in the night. 3 wagons. They said the Indian agent declared our winter rations forfeit. My father tried to stop them from taking the seed corn. One of them struck him with the butt of a rifle." Sinclair felt a murderous rage ignite within his chest. He knew the Indian agent, a corrupt, bureaucratic rat named Arthur Willis, who operated out of Fort Craig. Willis had been lining his own pockets for years, starving the native populations to sell their government-allotted supplies on the black market. But to hire thugs to raid an independent homestead? That was a new level of depravity. "Did you recognize any of them?" Sinclair asked, already shrugging off his heavy buffalo coat to wrap it around Crystal and her father. "One," Crystal said, pulling the heavy hide tight around her father's shivering shoulders. He wore a silver watch chain with a wolf's tooth hanging from it. He laughed when father fell. Sinclair's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Josiah Miller. Josiah was a former trapping partner of Sinclair's, a man who had turned to rustling and thievery when the beaver pelt market dried up. Josiah was ruthless, greedy, and held a long-standing grudge against Sinclair over a land dispute years prior. Josiah knew exactly who this family was, and he knew exactly what taking their food meant. It was a death sentence. "I brought meat," Sinclair said softly, pressing his forehead against Crystal's for a fleeting second. Enough to last you a week if you ration it. I'll chop wood. I'll get the fire going. Sinclair, you cannot go after them, Crystal pleaded, grabbing his thick wrist. There were 6 heavily armed men. They will kill you. They stole your life, Crystal, Sinclair replied, his eyes hardening into chips of flint. They stole your father's dignity. I'm not just going to get your supplies back. I'm going to make sure they never look in this direction again. Sinclair spent the next 3 hours chopping firewood, drawing water from the frozen creek, and butchering the elk meat he had brought from the high country. Once a roaring fire was established and a thick, rich stew was bubbling in the iron pot over the hearth, he gathered his gear. He checked the powder in his powder horn, sharpened his hunting knife on a whetstone until it could split a hair, and reloaded his Colt revolvers. He paused at the door, looking back at Crystal, who was spooning warm broth into her father's mouth. Lock the door, Sinclair instructed quietly. Do not open it for anyone but me. I will be back before the new moon. With a heavy heart and a mind consumed by vengeance, the mountain man stepped back out into the raging blizzard, his eyes locked on the faint, snow-filled ruts of wagon wheels leading toward the settlement. Tracking 3 heavy supply wagons through a Rocky Mountain blizzard should have been an impossible task, but Sinclair Caldwell read the wilderness like a scholar reads a worn leather book. The thieves had a head start, but they were weighed down by their ill-gotten bounty and arrogant enough to believe the weather would erase their sins. They didn't count on a man who had survived avalanches and grizzly attacks navigating by the subtle depressions in the snow and the snapped twigs of the scrub oak along the trail. For 2 days and 2 nights, Sinclair pushed himself and Jericho to the brink of exhaustion. The temperature plummeted well below zero, freezing the moisture in his breath to his beard and eyebrows. He fueled his body with strips of tough jerky and handfuls of snow, letting the burning anger in his chest keep the frostbite at bay. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, the storm broke, leaving a blindingly bright, pristine landscape. Sinclair crested a high ridge overlooking a narrow canyon known as Dead Man's Wash. Down below, huddled against the windbreak of the canyon walls, was a makeshift camp. 3 heavy freight wagons were circled around a massive, roaring bonfire. Sinclair tied Jericho securely to a sturdy pine well out of sight and crept down the ridge on his belly, blending in perfectly with the snow and shadows in his white and gray furs. He moved with the silent, deliberate grace of a mountain lion, closing the distance until he was perched on a rocky outcropping barely 50 yards above the camp. Through his brass spyglass, he observed the men below, 6 of them, just as Crystal had said. They were passing around a jug of cheap whiskey, laughing and warming their hands. And there, sitting on a crate of stolen dried corn, was Josiah Miller. The silver wolf's tooth dangled ostentatiously from his vest pocket, glinting in the firelight. Beside him stood Caleb Sterling, a massive brute of a man with a scarred face, and Jedediah Cross, a known horse thief and murderer. I'm telling you, Willis is going to pay top dollar for these woven blankets, Josiah was boasting loudly, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Them Eastern buyers at the railhead go crazy for authentic Apache work. We tell Willis we confiscated him from a hostile camp, he cuts us a check, and he sells them for triple. What about the old man and the girl? Caleb grunted, tossing a log onto the fire. You hit him pretty hard, Josiah. Josiah spat into the snow, a cruel smirk twisting his face. If the cold don't get him, the starvation will. Good riddance. Ain't nobody gonna go looking for him up that far. By spring, the wolves will have picked him clean, and no one will be the wiser. Up on the ridge, Sinclair's grip tightened around the stock of his rifle until his knuckles turned white. He could end Josiah right then and there. A single shot from the Hawken would take the man's head clean off. But as he looked at the 3 wagons, a different plan began to form in his mind. Killing them here would be justice, but it wouldn't solve Crystal's problem. The winter was long. The supplies they had stolen would keep the Apache family alive, but barely. Sinclair remembered Thomas's cough, the lack of warm winter clothing, the dwindling medicine. Josiah and his crew hadn't just raided Crystal's home. These wagons were full of crates stamped with the United States Army seal. Josiah's crew had been raiding military supply caches intended for the reservations and stockpiling them here before moving them to Arthur Willis's trading post. There were crates of flour, salted pork, heavy wool military blankets, medical supplies, and tin stoves. It was a king's ransom in winter survival gear. Sinclair didn't just want Crystal's supplies back. He wanted it all. He was going to take everything these miserable thieves had stolen, and he was going to leave them out here in the freezing cold with nothing but the clothes on their backs. As the sun dipped below the canyon rim, plunging the camp into deep, freezing shadows, Sinclair began to move. He waited until the whiskey took its toll. By midnight, 4 of the men were snoring loudly near the fire, huddled under blankets. Josiah and Caleb were left to take the first watch, but the liquor had made them sloppy. They sat on the far side of the fire, their backs to the wagons, smoking cheap cigars and complaining about the cold. Sinclair slipped down the rocky face, a shadow detaching itself from the mountain. He approached the horses tied to a picket line behind the wagons. With practiced hands, he calmed the beasts, whispering soft, rhythmic words to keep them from nickering. He sliced the picket line, securing the lead ropes of the 6 draft horses. He needed to neutralize the guards without firing a shot, which would wake the others. Sinclair drew his heavy hunting knife, reversing his grip so the heavy brass pommel faced outward. He crept up behind the wagons, using the massive wooden wheels for cover. Caleb stood up to stretch, tossing his cigar butt into the snow. He turned to walk toward the tree line to relieve himself. Sinclair melted into the darkness, following him. As soon as Caleb was out of earshot of the fire, Sinclair struck. He clamped a thick, leather-gloved hand over Caleb's mouth, simultaneously bringing the brass pommel of his knife down hard against the base of the man's skull. Caleb crumpled silently into the snow, unconscious before he even realized he was under attack. 1 down. Sinclair bound Caleb's hands and feet tight with leather rawhide, stuffing a rag into his mouth for good measure. He dragged the heavy man behind a snowbank and turned his attention back to the camp. Josiah was still sitting by the fire, poking the embers with a long stick, completely unaware that his right-hand man had just been taken out. Sinclair knew Josiah was a light sleeper and a quick draw. Taking him out hand-to-hand would be riskier. Sinclair moved to the nearest wagon, the one loaded with the army crates and Crystal's stolen goods. He carefully unhitched the heavy canvas cover, tying it down securely. He then silently harnessed 2 of the strongest draft horses to the wagon. The creak of the leather harnesses was masked by the popping of the bonfire and the howling wind whistling through the canyon. He had to get the wagon turned around and headed up the trail without waking the other 4 men. It was a monumental gamble. Sinclair climbed onto the driver's bench, unwrapping the long leather reins. He checked his Colt, making sure it was loose in its holster. With a sharp whispered command and a gentle flick of the reins, Sinclair urged the horses forward. The heavy wooden wheels crunched loudly in the hard-packed snow. Josiah's head snapped up. He spun around, his hand flying to his holster as he saw the lead wagon moving away from the camp. "Hey!" Josiah yelled, kicking the sleeping men near the fire. "Hey! Wake up! Someone's stealing the rig!" Sinclair didn't hesitate. He cracked the reins hard over the horses' backs. "Ha! Yah!" he roared, abandoning all stealth. Josiah drew his revolver and fired blindly into the dark. The bullet splintered the wooden bench inches from Sinclair's thigh. Sinclair turned, drew his Colt in one fluid motion, and fired back. He wasn't aiming to kill, not yet. He aimed for the bonfire. The heavy lead slug hit the glowing center of the fire, exploding a shower of hot sparks and burning ash directly into Josiah's face. Josiah screamed, dropping his gun and clawing at his eyes. The other men, disoriented and half-drunk, scrambled for their weapons, but Sinclair was already driving the heavy wagon hard up the canyon trail, the draft horses pulling with massive, desperate strides. He had the wagon. He had Crystal's supplies, plus a small mountain of stolen army provisions. But he knew Josiah Miller wouldn't let this go. They had horses, and as soon as Josiah could see again, they would be coming after him. The real battle was just beginning, and Sinclair Caldwell was ready to bring the entire mountain down on their heads. Hoofbeats echoed like cracked thunder through the narrow gorge. Sinclair Caldwell snapped the heavy leather reins, urging the massive draft horses higher into the treacherous incline of Dead Pine Ridge. He knew Josiah Miller wouldn't be far behind. The blinding snow had stopped, leaving the moon to illuminate the mountain pass in a stark, silver glow. The heavy wagon groaned, its iron-banded wheels fighting for purchase on the slick, frozen rock. Behind him, 3 riders crested the lower rise. Josiah was in the lead, his face wrapped in a bandana to protect his burn-blistered skin, riding with the furious desperation of a humiliated man. Beside him rode Jedediah Cross and a hired gun Sinclair didn't recognize. To survive, Sinclair needed to leverage the mountain itself. He quickly assessed the tactical situation. Advantage, disadvantage. Sinclair Caldwell, Josiah's thugs. Terrain knowledge, master level. Knows every blind corner and unstable snowbank. Poor. Reliant on following the wagon's deep tracks. Mobility, low. Driving a heavy, cumbersome freight wagon. High. Riding unencumbered saddle horses. Firepower, Hawken rifle, long-range accuracy, twin Colts. Repeating rifles, but firing wildly from horseback. Motivation, love, survival, and vengeance. Greed, bruised, ego, and whiskey. Sinclair reached behind the driver's bench, his hands furiously tearing at the canvas cover. He found what he was looking for. A small wooden keg marked U.S. Cavalry. Black powder. Willis's black market operation was moving munitions as well as food. Sinclair hauled the heavy keg onto his lap, his knife slicing through the thick rope handle. As the wagon rumbled through the tightest bottleneck of the pass, a narrow gap flanked by towering, snow-laden cliffs, he kicked the iron brake pedal, throwing the wagon into a harsh, sliding skid. He hoisted the powder keg and heaved it off the back of the wagon. It hit the icy trail, rolling directly into the center of the narrow choke point. Sinclair snapped the reins again, pushing the horses to a desperate gallop to clear the blast radius. Josiah and his men rounded the corner, their horses slipping on the icy rock. They saw the wagon pulling away and spurred their mounts forward, completely ignoring the small wooden keg resting in their path. Sinclair twisted in his seat, raising the heavy Hawken rifle to his shoulder. The moonlight caught the brass fittings. He didn't aim for the men. He aimed for the keg. He steadied his breathing, the cold air burning his lungs. "You boys wanted the mountain," Sinclair muttered into the wind. "Now you're going to get it." He pulled the trigger. The roar of the Hawken was instantly dwarfed by a deafening, earth-shattering explosion. The powder keg detonated, sending a massive fireball rocketing up the cliff walls. The concussive wave knocked Josiah and his men from their saddles, but the fire was only the catalyst. The true weapon was the mountain itself. The explosion fractured the fragile ice holding the massive snowpack above the pass. A deep, terrifying groan echoed through the canyon, followed by the terrifying rush of an avalanche. Tons of packed snow, ice, and jagged rock cascaded down the cliff face, burying the trail and the horses. Sinclair halted the wagon a safe distance away and waited until the white cloud of snow dust settled. Walking back to the edge of the newly formed ice wall, he looked down. Jedediah and the other hired gun were completely buried, their fates sealed beneath the crushing weight of the snow. But Josiah Miller was a survivor. The man had managed to dive behind an overhanging rock shelf. He crawled out from the debris, his leg twisted at a sickening angle, his repeating rifle lost to the snow. He looked up, coughing up blood and ice, to see Sinclair towering over him. A loaded Colt pointed directly at his chest. "You took their food, Josiah," Sinclair said, his voice as cold as the ice beneath their boots. "You sentenced an old man and a woman to starve. I should bury you right here." Josiah spat, clutching his broken leg. Willis will have you hung, Caldwell. You stole federal property." "I'm reclaiming stolen property," Sinclair corrected, holstering his weapon. He pulled a length of rawhide from his belt and quickly bound Josiah's hands to a sturdy, frozen pine root jutting from the rock. "I'm leaving you here, Josiah. If the cold doesn't take you, maybe the wolves will. Or maybe someone will find you in the spring." Sinclair turned his back on the screaming man and walked back to the wagon. He had survived the ambush, but Josiah's words echoed in his mind. "Willis will have you hung." Returning to the cabin now would only lead the corrupt Indian agent straight to Crystal and Thomas. He had to sever the snake's head. Dawn broke over the high desert, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Instead of heading south toward the Apache homestead, Sinclair steered the heavy wagon east, toward the military outpost of Fort Craig. Arthur Willis operated out of a lavishly furnished office just outside the fort's main gates, using the proximity to the military to legitimize his dealings. Sinclair knew Willis was expecting Josiah's crew to deliver the stolen goods before the inspector general arrived at the end of the month. By midday, the wagon rumbled into the muddy, snow-slushed courtyard of the trading post. Sinclair pulled the horses to a halt right in front of Willis's office doors. He jumped down from the bench, his buffalo coat sweeping the mud, and marched straight into the building, not bothering to knock. Arthur Willis sat behind a polished mahogany desk, a crystal glass of bourbon in his hand. He was a soft, plump man with perfectly oiled hair and a suit that cost more than most homesteaders made in a decade. Sitting across from him was a stern-faced military man, Captain John Hayes, the newly appointed quartermaster of Fort Craig. Willis jumped, spilling his bourbon. "Caldwell, what is the meaning of this intrusion? You stink of animal grease." "I brought your delivery, Willis," Sinclair said loudly, making sure Captain Hayes heard every word. "Though Josiah Miller ran into some trouble on the mountain, he won't be joining us." Willis's face drained of color. He darted a nervous glance at Captain Hayes. "I have no idea what you're talking about, you savage. Get out of my office before I have you arrested for trespassing." Sinclair ignored him, turning his attention to the captain. "Captain Hayes, I presume? I found a freight wagon abandoned up near Dead Pine Ridge. Looks like some thieves got buried in an avalanche." "The wagon is full of civilian winter supplies and a whole lot of military crates." Hayes stood up, his hand resting on the hilt of his cavalry saber. "Military crates? What kind of crates?" "Why don't we go take a look?" Sinclair offered, gesturing toward the door. Willis tried to scramble around the desk. "Captain, I insist you ignore this man. He is a known vagrant and a liar." Captain Hayes pushed Willis back with a firm hand. "Quiet, Agent Willis. If there are military supplies unaccounted for, it is my duty to investigate." The three men walked out into the freezing courtyard. Sinclair threw back the heavy canvas tarp, revealing the stolen treasure. The recovered manifest. Civilian goods. 3 dozen woven Apache blankets, 60 pounds of dried seed corn, 40 clay jars of smoked meats, and a trunk of hand-carved tools. Stolen military provisions. 12 crates of U.S. cavalry issue hardtack and salted pork. 5 barrels of black powder, minus the one Sinclair used. 6 crates of heavy wool winter uniforms. 4 boxes of standard issue medical supplies, including quinine and bandages. Captain Hayes stepped up to the wagon, prying open a crate of salted pork with his boot knife. He saw the Fort Craig quartermaster stamp burned into the wood. He turned to Willis, his eyes burning with fury. "Agent Willis," Hayes said, his voice dangerously low. "These provisions were reported lost in a river crossing 3 months ago. You signed the requisition forms yourself. You've been starving the reservations and stealing from the United States Army." "It's a setup," Willis stammered, sweating despite the freezing temperature. "Miller must have stolen them. I had nothing to do with this." "Josiah Miller works for you, Willis," Sinclair interjected smoothly. "Everyone in the territory knows it. He was bringing these civilian goods here to sell back east, and hoarding the army supplies to sell to the mining camps." Captain Hayes signaled to 2 armed sentries standing near the fort's gates. "Guards, place Agent Willis under arrest for theft of government property, treason, and corruption." As Willis was dragged away, kicking and screaming obscenities, Captain Hayes turned to Sinclair. The military man sized up the mountain man, taking in the bloodstains on his furs and the cold, unyielding look in his eyes. "You said you found this wagon abandoned, Mr. Caldwell?" Hayes asked, raising a skeptical eyebrow. "I did, Captain. Found it wandering out in the cold," Sinclair replied without blinking. Hayes looked at the civilian goods, the corn, the blankets, the smoked meat. He knew exactly who those belonged to, and he knew the suffering Willis's policies had caused. "The Army will reclaim its property," Hayes said slowly. "But those blankets and that corn, that's civilian property. Unclaimed." I suppose whoever found it has salvage rights." The captain paused, looking at the medical crates. "And the army usually pays a bounty for the recovery of stolen munitions. I'd say 2 crates of medical supplies and 3 crates of salted pork would be a fair finder's fee. Wouldn't you agree?" Sinclair nodded respectfully. "That sounds more than fair, Captain." "Get that wagon out of my courtyard, Caldwell," Hayes commanded, turning back toward the fort. "And if you see whoever caused that avalanche, tell them the army owes them a debt of gratitude." Sinclair climbed back onto the driver's bench. The threat was neutralized. The thieves were broken, and the corrupt agent was in chains. Now, it was finally time to go home. He turned the heavy draft horses south, toward the shadow of the foothills, where Crystal and Thomas were waiting. He was bringing back their stolen lives, and then some. Relentless gales tore across the frozen flats as Sinclair Caldwell pushed the heavy draft horses to their absolute limits. The journey back to the hidden valley was an agonizing battle against the elements. The brief reprieve in the storm had vanished, replaced by a bitter, blinding squall that threatened to bury the heavy supply wagon entirely. Sinclair's hands were numb, his face coated in a thick layer of ice, but the image of Crystal shivering in that ransacked cabin drove him forward through the impossible drifts. By the time the familiar tree line broke through the whiteout, twilight had descended, casting long, mournful shadows across the snow. Sinclair pulled the exhausted horses to a halt near the porch. He expected to see a faint glow of firelight leaking through the chinks in the logs. He expected to see the thin, gray ribbon of smoke rising from the stone chimney. There was nothing. The cabin was a dark, silent tomb against the snow. Panic, colder and sharper than the mountain wind, pierced Sinclair's chest. He vaulted from the driver's bench, not bothering to tie the horses, and sprinted for the heavy oak door. It was bolted from the inside. "Crystal!" Sinclair roared, pounding his massive, gloved fists against the timber. "Crystal, open the door! It's Sinclair!" Only the howling wind answered him. Stepping back, Sinclair threw his entire weight against the door. The frozen wood groaned. He hit it again, his shoulders screaming in protest, until the iron bolt on the inside splintered through the doorframe with a deafening crack. Sinclair stumbled into the freezing darkness of the room. The air inside was barely warmer than the blizzard outside. The hearth was completely cold, holding nothing but dead, gray ashes. "No," Sinclair breathed, dropping to his knees. In the corner, under the single thin blanket, lay Crystal and Thomas. Crystal had wrapped herself completely around her father, trying to use her own fading body heat to keep the old man alive. Her lips were blue, her breathing so shallow it barely stirred the frayed wool. Sinclair's survival instincts took over. He ran back out to the wagon, his muscles burning with adrenaline. He bypassed the civilian goods and tore into the military crates Captain Hayes had allowed him to take. He hauled 2 heavy iron camp stoves inside, followed by an armful of dry, split cedar he had stowed under the canvas, and a crate of thick U.S. cavalry-issue wool blankets. With trembling, frozen fingers, Sinclair struck a match. He built the fire with frantic precision, stacking the cedar over dry kindling. Within minutes, a roaring blaze illuminated the dark cabin, throwing desperate heat into the freezing air. He set up the iron stoves, stuffing them with wood to radiate warmth throughout the small room. Next came the medical supplies. Sinclair pried open the wooden box bearing the Fort Craig dispensary seal. He found glass bottles of quinine, smelling salts, and heavy tins of nutrient-rich beef bouillon. He filled a pot with snow, hanging it over the fire to melt and boil. Sinclair knelt beside Crystal, pulling the heavy army blankets over her and her father. He uncorked the smelling salts and waved the pungent vial beneath Crystal's nose. For a terrifying minute, nothing happened. Then Crystal gasped, her dark eyes fluttering open. She was disoriented, shivering violently as her body registered the sudden change in temperature. Her eyes focused on Sinclair, illuminated by the golden light of the roaring hearth. "Sinclair?" she whispered, her voice barely a rasp. "I'm here," Sinclair said, his voice breaking as he pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace, pressing her head against his thick buffalo coat. "I told you I'd come back." Crystal weakly pushed back, looking toward the open door. Her eyes widened as she saw the sheer volume of crates, barrels, and sacks Sinclair had dragged inside. There was towering stacks of salted pork, heavy sacks of flour, new winter clothing, and their own reclaimed woven blankets and seed corn. You brought it all back," she said, tears finally spilling hot down her frozen cheeks. "They stole your winter supplies," Sinclair smiled softly, wiping a tear from her face with his calloused thumb. "So I made sure to come back with twice as much." He spent the next 3 days nursing them back from the brink of death. He fed them rich broth, administered the army medicine to clear the fluid from Thomas's lungs, and kept the fires burning day and night. The mountain man who had spent his life seeking solitude had finally found the only people he was willing to fight the whole world to protect. Spring arrived in the Sangre de Cristo foothills with a defiant burst of color. The suffocating snow melted into rushing, crystal-clear creeks, and vibrant blue columbines pushed their way through the thawing earth. Thomas sat on the porch of the cabin, carving a piece of soft pine with a steady hand. The brutal swelling on his face had long since healed, leaving only a faint, distinguished scar. The army provisions Sinclair had secured had done more than just save their lives. They had thrived. When word reached the other isolated Apache families in the region about the surplus of food and medicine, Crystal and Thomas had shared the bounty. The stolen goods of a corrupt agent had ended up saving dozens of innocent lives during the harshest winter in a decade. Sinclair was down by the creek, washing the sweat from his neck after chopping a fresh cord of wood. He stood up, wiping his face with a towel, and smiled as he saw Crystal walking down the dirt path toward him. She wore a dress made from calico cloth he had traded for at the settlement, her dark hair shining in the midday sun. "My father wants to speak with you," Crystal said, stepping into his arms. Sinclair kissed her forehead. "Is he finally going to charge me rent for staying in the valley this long?" Crystal laughed, a sound that Sinclair thought was better than any birdsong in the territory. Something like that. As they walked back to the cabin, the heavy thud of approaching hooves echoed through the valley. Sinclair immediately stepped in front of Crystal, his hand resting instinctively on his holster. But it wasn't Josiah Miller or his thugs. Josiah had been found half frozen by a passing stagecoach and was currently sitting in a territorial prison awaiting the hangman's noose. Riding into the clearing was a small detachment of United States cavalry. Leading them was a man with a distinctive, forked beard and a canvas field uniform. Sinclair recognized him immediately from the descriptions passed around the trading posts. It was General George Crook, a man known for his unorthodox methods and his attempts to root out the very corruption Arthur Willis had perpetrated. General Crook halted his horse and dismounted, waving his men to stay back. He walked toward the porch, touching the brim of his hat respectfully as he looked at Thomas. "Thomas," Crook greeted. Then he turned his sharp gaze to the mountain man. "And you must be Sinclair Caldwell." "Depends on who's asking," Sinclair replied evenly. Crook chuckled dryly. "Captain Hayes sent me a very interesting report from Fort Craig a few months back. Said a solitary trapper managed to single-handedly expose Arthur Willis's embezzlement ring, recover stolen army munitions, and miraculously deliver an entire wagon of lost civilian goods to an unmarked valley. The mountain works in mysterious ways, General," Sinclair said, not giving an inch. Crook reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a rolled, heavy parchment sealed with red wax. He handed it to Thomas. "Willis is facing a federal judge, and the Inspector General decided that since this valley was effectively sustained by your family's distribution of those recovered goods, the least the government could do is formally recognize your right to remain on it," Crook explained. "That deed secures this land for you and your descendants. No Indian agent can ever touch it." Thomas took the parchment, his weathered hands tracing the wax seal. He looked up at Crook and offered a slow, solemn nod of gratitude. After the cavalry rode out, leaving the valley in peaceful silence once more, Thomas turned to Sinclair. He held out the deed. "This land is ours," Thomas said, his voice deep and steady. He looked between Sinclair and Crystal, a knowing smile touching his eyes. "But it will need strong hands to work it, a man to help build the fences, a husband for my daughter." Sinclair looked at Crystal. The fierce, independent woman who had stolen a mountain man's heart beamed back at him, her eyes shining with unshed, happy tears. Sinclair reached out, taking her hand in his. He had spent his entire life wandering the high peaks, running from the world. But looking at Crystal, surrounded by the towering pines and the rushing creek, Sinclair Caldwell knew he never had to run again. He was finally home. If you found your heart pounding during Sinclair's daring mountain rescue and Crystal's unyielding survival, hit that like button to support real frontier legends. Share this video with history buffs who crave untamed Wild West romance. Don't let these forgotten tales fade into the snow. Subscribe to our channel for more thrilling stories of courage, love, and justice against all odds. Turn on notifications so you never miss an adventure.